So, thank you and welcome to what will be the last panel of this day, dedicated to Georgia, dedicated to the Black Sea from the perspective of Georgia. And we have only, which is something I think is positive, 3 participants because it will give each of you more time to speak and explain your arguments. Some of you have already approached me saying you would like to mention this and that's absolutely fine. I do have questions which I have prepared, but I'm a moderator, not a dictator, so you can always, I would hope you also answer and consider my questions, but you're of course welcome to add things that I might have not picked up. I will introduce you, and then without any ado, we will jump into the discussion right away. We have in the middle here, from Georgia, Natia Seskuria, Director of the Regional Institute for Security Studies in Tbilisi. We have next to me here Andrew Novo, Professor at the National Defense University in Washington, I suppose, and Tassos Kriekoukis, a diplomat who was ambassador in many countries. He was, among other countries, in Germany, and for this panel, the most important, he was the first ambassador of Greece to Georgia in the end of the 90s, I think.
No, mid-90s.
Mid-90s, even earlier.
I left the end of the 90s.
Okay, so from mid to end 90s. And let's not lose time and jump directly into the discussion. And I would like to start with a question to Andrew Novo. While preparing for this panel, I tried to find different essays that you have written about the topic, and I found 2 that I would like to pick up here. One was titled "Victory for the Strong Means Defeat for the West," and it was published only now, less than a month ago, on March 24th. And there were a couple of sentences that really made me think, and that I think are worthwhile to debate here a little further, because they consider the big picture of what we are talking about. You wrote, among other things, let me quote, "The world must wake up and recognize that we are confronted with 2 elements of truly enormous importance: the threat to the existence of the Ukrainian state and the threat to the American-backed international system." Now, you referred to the world. When we have a look at the world, we will see many important actors that would not consider a demise of the American-backed system as a threat. On the contrary, I'm not only mentioning the obvious, like China and Russia, but you have India, you have Brazil maybe partly, you have some certain elements in states within the European Union. So, I mean, I would suppose all of us on the panel, we want Ukraine to win, and we do share this observation. But how do we make the world, how do we make the narrative that all of us believe is correct more convincing in other parts, especially in the global south?
So thank you for the question, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here today. I think the title holds a little bit of the answer to that. It was taken from the idea, which is from the Greek historian Thucydides, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And that's a dangerous world to live in on a fundamental level. And so I wanted to connect that to the ideas of the American-led international order, which is the Western order, and it's the order that is articulated in the preamble to the NATO treaty, the ideas of democracy and sovereignty and individual liberty. And so I think that those are the ideas that are under threat, and those are the ideas that we can speak to when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine, to try to get nations across the world to understand why this is such an important conflict. We see materialized, how that materializes in Russia's war in Ukraine, that it's not only about eroding the international system, but for Putin it does seem to be about destroying the Ukrainian state. And so returning to the title of the piece which you mentioned, I don't think any country or any leader wants to be in a world where you can just eliminate states or you can destroy and invade your neighbors as easily. Certainly, maybe some leaders
I think,
may wish to.
I'm just happy with that.
But most people would not want to have that world.
Now, when we talk about, as you called it, the American-backed international system, no one knows, you don't, I know, no one here knows who will win the upcoming US elections. But, there is a certain chance that Donald Trump will be again president. Now, I usually do not watch the Black Sea so much. I do, as far as Bulgaria is concerned. I watch the Balkans. But in the Balkans, there's really a certain nervousness, let's put it this way. Respectively, let's make a difference here. Serbia, for example, is hardly waiting for Trump to be elected and Richard Grenell becoming his foreign minister. He has already created havoc when he was special envoy for Trump. And for the same reason, for example, Kosovo, but also partly Bosnia, is fearing just that. What will be left of the American-backed international system if Trump wins? It's highly speculative, I understand.
Sure, and I should give the mandatory disclaimer that I don't speak on behalf of the United States government or the National Defense University. But I think that I can slightly deflect the question, if I'm honest, and answer it in a way that says that the United States, like every country in the world, does not have a singular unified idea of what its interests are and what its mission, let's say, is in the world. And so what we see with the previous administration under President Trump and the current administration with President Biden is how wide that gap can be. And you see this in European countries as well, where if one party is in power, there is a greater support for Ukraine, and another party is actually using their position of opposition to say, well, if we come to power, we want to stop supporting Ukraine. So I think, unfortunately, these grand terms, the terms that inspire us, like an international system or the comity of nations or cooperation and democracy and freedom, those are grand terms that inspire people, but because they're so broad, they can also be interpreted quite differently depending on who is interpreting them and who's in power. So hopefully, regardless of who wins the American elections, the leaders of the United States will understand the value in the values that America has traditionally spoken to.
Let us hope so indeed. I will let's move on to the next. I have another set of questions based on what you have written. I have more questions than we can cover anyhow. And let's move directly to Georgia. This will be a panel when we speak about Georgia, but not without Georgia. And we were emailing back and forth a little bit in the preparation to this panel, and I asked you what you think is important, what you would like to speak about. And one sentence you wrote me in an email really mesmerized me, because you said, you know, obviously we should speak about the impact of the war in Ukraine on Georgia, but also on the, I quote, opportunities and threats for Georgia. Now, we hear a lot about threats. I was surprised, and I'm happy to hear more about the opportunities for Georgia. What are they?
Of course. Firstly, thank you very much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be back at Delphi Forum. The war, Russia's war against Ukraine, has created a very specific challenges for Georgia. That said, of course, Georgia has been under Russian occupation since 2008, and when we are talking about the Black Sea security, I think the first signs of the insecurity within the Black Sea have appeared back in the days in 2008 when Russia occupied the Georgian territories, and as of today, roughly two-thirds of the Georgia's Black Sea coast is under occupation. So that, of course, creates very significant challenges, and when we are talking about occupation, this is a long-term and ongoing challenge, because Russia uses a lot of different tools. When we are talking about threats, we need to take into consideration a whole realm of unconventional tools that Russia is using against Georgia, and we can talk about this in further details. But at the same time, I have to mention that there are certain opportunities that Georgia needs to use, because back in the days when 2008 war happened, and I would argue as well in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, the Black Sea was not really a priority area for the West, and we still don't have, unfortunately, the Black Sea, so-called Black Sea strategy. But the good news is that it is under elaboration, and allies, NATO and the US, are now thinking more thoroughly when it comes to what is the Western strategy and how to deal with the Russian threat within the Black Sea. But at the same time, when it comes to opportunities, I think the high relevance of the Black Sea and the acknowledgement of the Russian threats within the region has given Georgia opportunities to get closer to the European Union and possibly with NATO, even though when it comes to NATO, of course, we don't have the progress that we have seen in case of the European Union, and I'm referring to the candidacy status. However, at the same time, of course, opportunities need to be used, and when we are discussing the impact of the war, Russia's war against Ukraine on Georgia, we have to take into consideration that, unfortunately, its impact is both domestic and external. And when we are talking about domestic impact, we see that Russia and pro-Russian forces are much more proactive these days in Georgia in order to precisely detach and also isolate Georgia and make sure that these opportunities won't be used.
I think this is something that we should pick up on also later about the pro-Russian forces. Now, when you say opportunities lie also within the fact that the region now enjoys higher interest, I completely agree, even though, of course, when small countries enjoy high interest in the international scene, this is not always something positive. I remember between 2010 and 2015, the country we are in enjoyed high international interest, and it was not the happiest of years for Greece, but of course I understand what you mean. And I would like also to quote from an essay that I read of yours, titled, "Is Russia Expanding Its Battlefront to Georgia?" It was published in October 2023, and you, in this essay or in this article, explained Russian plans to establish a naval base in Abkhazia, which would obviously, as you write, render the region a legitimate target for Ukrainian military strikes. It's the port of, I hope I pronounced this correct, Ochamchire, you can correct me later, which currently I understand is not deep enough to host large warships from Russia, but if they would invest considerable amounts of money and adjust the infrastructure, it could be. Now, first question, what's the state of play here? This is half a year ago. Has Russia started to upgrade this port, or where are we at?
Yes, well, when we are talking about threats, of course, this is one of the major threats that now Georgia is facing. And we have to take into consideration the fact that there have been a number of claims in the past, after 2008 war, after 2014, that the expansion of the port was in the making, but it did not happen at that time.
So
however,
even now, as we speak, it hasn't happened yet.
As we speak, it is very hard to determine what's the current state of play. However, there are some satellite imageries available. I had an opportunity to work with BBC monitoring team to look at those images, and it is clear that there are some ongoing works, but it is very hard to determine how long it will take and how this will evolve. However, I can say a few words about the implication of this port should Russia proceed with its plans of expansion. This would be a major threat for Georgia in terms of its plans to establish itself as the so-called connectivity hub with the help of the Anaklia port. Well, Anaklia deep sea port, that is a whole separate topic, which has been a much controversial project that was unfortunately stopped in 2020, but since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there have been a number of reports that Georgia will proceed with its plans to build the port. However, when it comes to the Russian threats, of course, the proximity of the Anaklia port with the Ochamchire port makes it almost impossible for any investor to come in and build the Anaklia port and to use the port in order to create further opportunities for the Western allies to make use of Georgia's, take advantage of Georgia's geostrategic location at the time when the allies are trying to bypass Russia and isolate Russia when it comes to connectivity in the region. And of course, you mentioned that the threat of Georgia being indirectly or even directly dragged into the war will be higher, in a sense that should Russia use this port against Ukraine, Ukraine will of course have a legitimate reason to respond, and in that case, of course, the Black Sea will become even more dangerous than it is right now for Georgia.
Yeah, and maybe one last question for the first round. I'm quoting from the same text of yours that I've been quoting before. You end this by saying, Georgia cannot stop Moscow. This, I guess, refers to the port, but also generally. However, what Georgia can do is to be much more proactive on the international stage by condemning Russia's aggression and its militarization in the Black Sea. Can you give examples, concrete examples of what do you mean by it can be more proactive? What could it do that it hasn't done so far?
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to stopping Russia to pursue its plans, of course, there are not any sort of, there isn't any leverage that Georgia has directly because military option is of course off the table, and Putin and Russia nowadays has effective control over occupied Abkhazia. So in that sense, Georgia has no control over its occupied territory. However, when I mentioned that it is important for Georgia to be more proactive and engage with partners and allies, what I mean by that is that Russia needs to know that there will be costs if it proceeds and if it expands the battlefield to Georgia. By that I mean the potential expansion of sanctions and also working with partners, with NATO allies to increase Georgia's capabilities, and especially when it comes to maritime capabilities, Georgia has very limited capabilities because, as you know, in 2008, Russia has destroyed the Georgian Navy, and its state did not really give any ground for Georgia to rebuild its navy. So currently, Georgia has, I would argue, a problem of sea blindness. And when it comes to defensive capabilities, Georgia has very limited capabilities. So in that sense, I think working with NATO allies should be a crucial priority for Georgia, which I would argue that we have not really been seeing proactive moves with that priority.
Thank you very much. And let's move to Tassos, who knows the country we talk about also personally, because he has been there, posted there for many years, as we mentioned in the introductory round. And I also know that there are certain things that you would like to emphasize, and as I said before, please do so. But allow me to ask at least one of the questions that I wanted to ask you when I prepared myself for this panel. And this is, because you're a diplomat, this is about European Union enlargement. As we all know, after Moldova and Ukraine, also Georgia has been recommended by the Commission for the start, to receive candidate status. What I'm wondering now, I do go to Moldova often. I lived in Ukraine, but many, many years ago. I've twice only been to Georgia. Unfortunately, I do not know the country well. But I do watch the Balkans. And it was in this country, not here, but in this country, in Saloniki, or next to Saloniki in Portokaras, that in 2003, we gave the famous promise that the future of the Western Balkans is in the European Union. This was 2003, so we are 21 years on. What I'm wondering when looking at what I only call the so-called European perspective of the Balkans, aren't now Ukraine, Moldova, and especially Georgia just walking into the Balkan trap of eternal negotiations with no results?
Kamar Zobat. So I don't want to emphasize anything, so I try to answer your question. Well, we have to boost the Georgian European perspective for many, many reasons. Of course, I belong to the generation which has seen that enlargement has been to the detriment of the force of the European institutions. The European Union, before really when it was the Maastricht Treaty, was a very solid corpus. With enlargement, the situation has changed. I'm not going to analyze this. But as 30 years ago, I was ambassador in Georgia 30 years ago, what happened actually in the early 90s is that we put on the basket the interests we have with enlargement. And I think the same thing fits here. And I think that the Georgians, maybe I'm wrong, today they want to consider themselves not a Black Sea country, but more an Eastern European country. I read about this several times. They want more to identify themselves to the Eastern European family. I mean, I'm talking the eastern part of, or the western part of the Black Sea. And you see that you're talking about the menace of this port in Abkhazia. It's true that Georgia and the region didn't profit yet from all the advantages given by the fantastic commercial opportunities the region has today. And of course, the infrastructure of Georgia is unfortunately lagging behind, and we have really to help Georgia in this sense. Of course, it's the European Union. It's your great bunch of international trade agreements which help. But when you see it, you have the Poti port, you have the Batumi port, and I hope that the Anaklia port is going to be a deep sea port, because what we have seen really the last year, or more than last year, is that the Trans-Caspian route and the goods from China, which are coming, I mean, I'm talking the region, not only China, because it accumulates. There were enormous traffic jams of, Lastwagen, the vehicles transporting the goods. So you see that there is a bottleneck, which is to the detriment, according to me, of the Georgian economy. So the ports themselves, the moment they are going to be up to date with huger docks, especially deepened, then that will be an enormous asset for Georgia. And their rapprochement to the European Union. When you have more European companies investing, more European goods to handle, then the port in Abkhazia is going to be less of a menace. Of course, I don't know that you don't like it, but the more European become your ports, because I heard that, for example, in Anaklia, there will be one of the most important electricity cables going, to Romania. And you understand, Russia is under sanctions. I know very well that you are very, very careful about the sanctions, and Georgia has a particular status on it. But I don't think that an occupied Abkhazia is the total drama. Of course, it's a drama. But the moment the three ports become competitive and well-oriented to the European goods and Western goods, in Russia, they cannot really do the same things, for sure. Of course, my wish is that this port is not going to be constructed. That's my wish. But maybe it's not the end of the world. The moment you profit of your European perspective and European investments. It's, I don't know, I talked a little bit too long, and you'll manage because you are the oldest nation of the Black Sea. It's true. So you have some rights to put really a lot of efforts in your rail system, in your road system, and especially in ports. Because, and I finish there, the road, for example, Kars, Tbilisi, Turkey, there is a danger for the ports because it's going to bypass the ports. It's, I'm talking about these transcaucasus routes because it passes by Tbilisi, but through Tbilisi, but it bypasses the ports. And we need to have a balance in this Black Sea Georgian perspective.
Thank you very much. I think we have, it's unbelievable, time flies. We have only one round left, and we have to be concise. I want to quote from another article of yours. I have to skip all the other questions I've prepared anyway, which you published last year. I wrote down the date somewhere. May 2023, so almost a year ago. It was called The Moment of Truth. Of course, you remember it. And you said there, I quote again, unlocking more assistance, military assistance for Ukraine is unlikely without new successes. The opposite is also true. Setbacks in the field will provide political cover for those in the West who already believe that Ukraine has received enough and that the time has arrived for negotiations and peace involving the sacrifice of large chunks of Ukrainian territory. Now, obviously, you wrote this before the offensive of Ukraine, which was, for whatever reasons, underwhelming, which didn't fulfill the hopes that most of us, that we all probably had. So where are we now? Are we really at the point B of your analysis, saying that setbacks in the field will provide political cover for those in the West who say we should stop aiding Greece? Where do we stand now?
Well, I think you see a little...
aiding Ukraine, not Greece. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you see a little bit of both of those factors. I think you see that the lack of success, and of course the Ukrainians were very open about trying to moderate our expectations. You see a lot of people, I mean, this is one reason why the American defense package has been held up. The argument, at least, is, well, if they haven't succeeded yet, why should we continue to put more into this? And of course, as you said, the flip side is also true. You say, well, look at how well they've done. We need to actually give them enough to succeed. I think one of the shortcomings for both the United States and Europe in its policy toward Ukraine has been that we are entirely reactive, and we delay and we drag our feet, and then we promise that we will give something, and then it's 6 months or 9 months or a year before they actually have it. And that lag is very, very difficult and frustrating.
Actually, now while listening to you, I remember, I think it was Wolfgang Ischinger, the former main organizer of the Munich Security Conference, but I'm not 100% sure, who said that we should turn it around. We should tell Putin, if you do this, we do this. Like if you attack Kharkiv, we deliver Taurus, whatever. Do you think this would be, that would be better than just reacting?
It would, and it would also, I think it relates a little bit to the question of Georgia and to the Black Sea, yeah. Because we have a little bit treated Ukraine as if it is happening alone. And it's a question for Eastern Europe, it's a question for Poland, it's a question for NATO, it's a question for the Baltic countries, but it's not. And that's part of why I think the Black Sea is important, because it's part of the strategic whole. In Russia's annexation of Crimea, its invasion of Ukraine has put the Black Sea in the spotlight as a place where there is an active conflict. And so one of the ways in which the West can try to act in a more assertive way is by looking at this conflict with Russia in a broader geographical perspective and thinking of more proactive measures that we can take.
Thank you. I have so many more questions which I think are very interesting, but this clock is brutal. So I'm going to jump one more time to you. And I would like to ask you, because it concerns you directly as a citizen of Georgia, about how realistic you consider the so-called European perspective for Georgia to be. Just 2 or 3 figures which I think we should keep in mind here. The membership talks with Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia took 34 months, generally, from the beginning to the stop, so a little bit less than 3 years. Estonia, Poland, and Slovenia were negotiating 56 months, 4.5 years, from the first day to membership. Bulgaria and Romania, 58 months, and the record holder, Croatia, 68 months, which is 5.5 years. The Western Balkan countries negotiate for more than 10 years, for more than a decade, and they have closed like 2 or 3 chapters, or others like North Macedonia are even waiting to begin. Now, when looking at that, how optimistic are you? This is a little bit insinuating in my question. You can, of course, say you are very optimistic, whatever, but how optimistic are you that you will live to see the day that Georgia will become a member of the European Union?
I'm optimistic. However, we need to take into consideration the fact that currently the domestic situation in Georgia is very difficult, I would say. And Georgia needs to accomplish certain tasks that were very openly put forward by the European Union. And unfortunately, the fact that Georgia did not manage to accomplish those tasks earlier made us lose time because, as you know, Ukraine and Moldova are ahead of Georgia in terms of the accession talks, while Georgia and we are obviously very happy about the fact that Georgia got the candidacy status, but I think Georgia should be ahead of compared to where it is right now. I'm optimistic because overwhelming majority of the Georgian citizens are pro-European. They see their identity, their future within the European Union. And despite the challenges in Georgia, I think there is a societal consensus that that's how Georgia should move ahead. So,
which means the stagnation of the Western Balkans, from your point of view, is not an indication for how it will go in...
It is a very different geopolitical situation right now. And when we talked about the opportunities at the beginning of our conversation, I think that's precisely what I meant. And I do not think that Georgia would be in this place in terms of the association agreement, candidacy status, if it wasn't Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. And that's what I mean by different geopolitical situation, which gives Georgia an opportunity to proceed and accelerate its accession process. However, of course, I do not think that the current geopolitical situation will provide Georgia with an opportunity to skip certain steps, because the homework needs to be done, and the homework in terms of the reforms agenda and in terms of what Georgia needs to do at home in order to get there is on the table right now.
Thank you. Allow me to ask the diplomat on our panel. I hear this very often, like, okay, European Union enlargement wasn't really making any progress, but the war in Ukraine was a watershed. Things are different now. Are they?
Do you mean according to the past? Or
well, I mean, we have seen declarations, we have seen speeches, we have seen Moldova becoming...
We have, first of all, to see 2 factors, which are in antithesis. The one is what we have to gain politically. And in this case, those who take the decisions would like to hurry. But on the other hand, you cannot water down the criteria, because that's suicide for the Union. The moment, for example, if I remember well, you have 12 criteria to fulfill. And they are concerning actually social problems. I mean, judicial system, human rights, democratic procedures, and so on. And this is something which will be very difficult to water down, because we have seen phenomena, even in the European Union, which provoked really the spirit of the Union. There were one or two countries which didn't really respect. So we have to have a safety valve.
Can I add one more question? Scholz and Macron have said, yes, we need new members, but before we need to reform the unanimity principle of voting in the European Union. Do you think Greece sees it the same way?
Look, first of all, we haven't seen very much concrete proposals. We are here at Delphi, and I don't want really to play the role of the oracle. But it's that we, in Greece, if we see really the concrete proposals, why not? I think that if the moment they are going to the right direction, it's really something the majority of the European member states will follow. I am somebody who experienced the French-German Acts, which was really the most solid element before the big enlargement. You agree on that? And it has been lost when we really deteriorated the status of our institutions. Because the Europe of Jacques Delors was not exactly the Europe that followed. During the crisis, we were listening to what the prime ministers or the presidents were saying. Before the crisis, we were following what the institutions were saying. Delors was there. And I think the moment we reinforce the institutions, we have a different European Union, more solid, where we can really amend things which are not functioning well.
Thank you very much. I have to jump in here because the organizers told me make sure to be on time. We needed 2 or 3 times more of the amount to discuss the question, I think, but this is how it goes on confidence. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the few, but I think still you listened to what we said, so thank you very much that you have stayed here for the last panel of the day, and I hope we'll have more time to discuss Georgia and maybe in a more positive surrounding next year here in Delphi. Thank you very much. Thank you.